and one is Israel. I have a separate talk on war and national defense policy, and that's just too long and too involved. The Bible says a lot about that to include into this, so it's a separate talk, and it was not requested for today, but I do talk about it some in the book, so for those who are interested in just war theory and the biblical basis for that and how to conduct a war in a justified manner, and when is it justified to go and invade another country, etc. I talk about that some in the book, again, with that QR code in your notes that can link to it, and if you can't get it to work, let me know and I'll get it for you. So with that said, let's dive in. So with immigration, obviously, what's that? That's the idea of people groups mixing and intermingling with each other, right? And we also know, obviously, as we talked about yesterday, Genesis 11, 6 through 8 kind of talks about when the people were initially spread. It says, the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they all have the same language. And this is what they began to do, and now nothing which they purpose to do will be impossible for them. That is, they're all together under Nimrod, building the Tower of Babel, like we talked about last night. Come, that is God saying, let us go down and there confuse their language, so they will not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the whole earth, and they stopped building the city. And we also mentioned the passage in Acts 17, 26 to 27, that said, he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him. Very interesting. That's that last little part of that passage is often not, I don't hear that I just hear the first part quoted, but that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, part included. That God's big part of his motivation for breaking the people up at Babel and spreading them across into individual people groups is that they would seek God instead of, as Josephus pointed out, and Genesis 11 speaks about this a little too, in their united conceit and strength, they would say, let's make a name for ourselves and glorify ourselves as God. Instead, they, as divided peoples, would become dependent and seek for God and even find him and worship him. Interesting. So that's clearly God's design, is that the people groups are spread abroad throughout the world, and that they're divided by language and people group. So where does immigration fit into that? Because certainly we see immigration happening on a grand scale, and certainly migration happening on a grand scale in Europe and the United States, especially today. Literally millions of people pouring across national boundaries, many of them illegally, into nations. So how do we as Christians think about this as a modern phenomenon that's obviously becoming a political hot point, especially where I'm from in Texas? It's a huge issue. But I'm sure it even touches you guys to some extent up here, because we have refugees being transported to different states, and immigrants eventually find their way to different states. So again, ultimately, I don't think we have any Native American Indians here, so we're all ultimately the offspring of immigrants, right? So I mean, immigration is a part of the American character at the same time. It's a very unique nation. Well, let's see. There's some passages to talk about this. Psalm 106:35 and Ezra 9:2 talk about the people of Israel and them intermingling with other nations. And obviously, they're a very special people. And so I just, bear with me as I read through this. Don't jump to conclusions of what I'm trying to say here. But it says in Psalm 106, but they mingled with the nations and learned their practices. And this is a negative sense of what the people of Israel did. And then in Ezra 9:2, it says, for they have taken some of their daughters as wives for themselves and for their sons, so that the holy race has intermingled with the peoples of the lands. Indeed, the hands of the princes and the rulers have been foremost in this unfaithfulness. I think what we can take from this is certainly the idea that, in the New Testament, you can say it was applied in the sense that we should not be unequally yoked with unbelievers in marriage, right? And this was kind of the same concept for the Jews. They were God's chosen people. They were intermarrying with other nations that were not worshiping God, and these pagan spouses were leading them astray, especially in the case of, for example, Solomon marrying foreign wives. They led his heart astray. And so that's really what these passages are saying. So again, I don't want you to misunderstand me that I'm taking this passage out of context and saying that marrying someone from another country is sinful or that immigration is wrong. I'm not trying to say that. I'm simply just giving some context of what the Bible talks about this issue. And particularly that idea of that word that's used for mingling here, intermingling, it's also used in Daniel 2:42-43 to talk about the kingdom of the Antichrist in the end times, this system of 10 kings, the 10 horns that give their authority to the beast. It's talking about them here and this is the vision of that Nebuchadnezzar had of the statue, remember, with the head, the body, and then the loins and the legs, and that it was, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then Rome. And then Rome had a near and a far principle to it. The near term has already happened in the past, and those were the legs of iron. But then the feet, the feet and the toes, says, as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of pottery. I believe that reference is to the end times kingdom, whereas there's just the legs of iron were the previous Rome that has already existed. So this mixed one between pottery or clay with iron, it says, the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay. So some of the kingdom will be strong and part of it will be brittle. And in that you saw the iron mixed with common clay, they will combine with one another in the seed of men. And that word combine with one another is the very same root Hebrew as we just saw in these previous passages that talked about mingling with the nations or intermingling. So it's that idea of and it's combining together in the seed of men. It's literally the sperm of men. So it's literally an intermarriage and intermingling of different people groups. But they will not adhere to one another, even as iron does not combine with pottery. So I think it's very interesting that a mark of a very clear defining characteristic of this end times kingdom. And in fact, we know from another prophecy, the one of the four beasts, it says that fourth beast will be different from all the other ones before it. And apparently one of the ways in which it will be different, even from previous Rome, is that it will be marked by an intermingling of many different people groups, basically the reunification of all the people groups back into one, just like we saw at Babel when all the world was one before God divided them up. Very interesting, I think, especially when based on my understanding of it, it's coming out of, it's viewed as basically being a second coming of that old Roman Empire, so it's clearly rooted in the West, and especially in Europe, which is where the old Roman Empire was based. We have an enormous migrant crisis going on where millions of people from the Middle East and Africa are pouring into Europe and intermingling there and becoming a very, very mixed people groups throughout Europe. I don't know if you guys have heard of the Prime Minister of Hungary. He is Viktor Orban. He has spoken repeatedly about this and gotten very criticized by the media for just saying that this mass migration going on is a real problem for Europe and how he views it as a negative. He's been very attacked by Brussels, the European Union, and other globalist groups for speaking out against that. Anyway, I just think it's very interesting that this is a quality of the end times kingdom. So just something to keep in mind. Leviticus 19:33-34, obviously he's talking about God is giving his instructions to the people of Israel. And he says, when a stranger resides with you in your land, you shall not do him any wrong. The stranger who resides with you shall be to you as the native among you, and you shall love him as yourself. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So again, God's part of his model for his chosen people and his government in the Old Testament times. They were supposed to be very welcoming and kind to immigrants that came among them. And another principle, obviously, that this applies to all government policy, but I think it especially applies to the immigration issue, is Romans 13:6-7. It says, for because of this, that is, for because these rulers are ministers of God for your good, you also pay taxes. For rulers are servants of God, devoting themselves to this very thing. In other words, being God's servant to those who pay taxes. Pay to all what is due them, tax to whom tax is due, custom to whom custom, respect to whom respect, honor to whom honor. In other words, the purpose of government is to serve, obviously to serve as God's minister, punish evil and reward good, but to serve the good of those who pay it taxes, who it's obliged to serve their interests. So whatever the government's immigration policy is, it must serve the interests of the people that it's called to govern, not be concerned with globalism or something like that. So obviously that's a lot of interesting principles. What I would say are some key principles here, and we'll kind of sum up all these at the end, but the basic idea here is that I think we can conclude that that national sovereignty is important and national borders are important, and that mass unrestrained migration is not a part of God's design as per what he did at the Tower of Babel. That the mass reunifications of all the peoples into one big people group is not a good thing. At the same time, I think it's also based on the model of of what God instructed his people Israel to do and how they treated immigrants, and also just basic Christian charity and how we are supposed to show love to others. And even if you look at the context of our nation, that we are a nation of immigrants, that just because, while I personally am of the view that I think we should have a strong border and a secure border and not have open immigration and unlimited, unrestrained immigration, at the same time, the people that do come into this country as immigrants, we should not treat them badly. Just because they're from another country does not mean we should take advantage of them or treat them in an unchristlike manner. So I think there's a balance there. That's personally my understanding of these principles. Does anyone have any quick comments on that? And it is 11 o'clock, so for those of you who need to leave, just so you know, it is 11. No comments? Questions? Yes, sir.
I'm not in favor of all the freebies that these people are getting. My taxes should be strictly for the tax dollars I pay, for my town and community, and not for supporting unknown people coming in, who years ago had they come in with 100% responsible for their own livelihood.
Amen. 100% agree. And I think that's very consistent with that Romans 13 passage. We pay taxes to our governing authorities because they serve our good as ministers of God, punishing evil, rewarding good, not as providers and subsidizers of people coming in looking for handouts. Yes, absolutely. That said, there are many immigrants who come here with the full intent of working very hard and building a new life for themselves. They're not coming here for handouts. So again, I would just say, there are some that do, but we shouldn't just paint them all with that brush. Anyone else have any comments?
What about the world with the homeless problem? Is that increasing because we've got all these immigrants now breaking through?
Yeah, I think that probably contributes to it. From what I've seen in Texas, for example, especially with Latin American immigration, culturally, they typically all tend to live in the same house, and so generally, and most Latin American culture, again, I'm generalizing, which I know is offensive to some, but just for the sake of answering your question, they're generally very hardworking people. And so what I've seen in Texas is a lot of the immigrants, most of them probably illegally, will work very hard in manual jobs, and they will just pool their resources together and either rent or buy a home. And the negative of that is that you have cars parked all over the sidewalks and blocking the streets, and the sidewalks get destroyed, and they play loud music, and it can be really obnoxious and just overcrowded conditions, which are a negative. But you don't typically, I think, see many of the Hispanic immigrants being homeless on the street. Most of the homeless people are drug addicts, frankly, and that's why you see, for example, San Francisco and Denver and even in Austin. And you should be using examples of you guys up here in the east, northwest. But in Texas, it's Austin, where a lot of these druggies live, and even in parts of Dallas. But the vast majority of homeless are people who have substance abuse issues that prevents them from being able to do any kind of job. But I don't find that with many of the immigrants. I find I'm sure there's a lot of human trafficking and stuff around the border, but by the time they reach a place like Dallas or one of the main cities even, they're either there because they have a relative who's already there and somewhat established and they're just joining their house, or they've worked really hard, at doing lawn care or some other construction or some other manual task where they're working really hard and putting food on the table. Obviously the negatives are, they don't typically pay very much in taxes, and their kids all go to the public schools, which dilutes raises your tax bill, and they go to the hospitals and get free health care because they can't afford it, and that raises our tax bill and things like that. So, there are negatives for sure, but I wouldn't put homelessness as one of the biggest issues for that. I'm sure there are homeless, but pretty much all the ones I've seen are drug addicts. So, all right, great. Well, we'll move on now to the next section, diplomatic relations. So this is really just the idea of, again, kind of what we were talking about last night, nations interacting with each other, in particular ideas like treaties and alliances and things like that. Okay, this isn't like war or anything like that. It's more just treaties and alliances between nations. See, God gave his people specific instructions about this. Exodus 23 is one of those places. In verses 31 to 33, God said, I will set your boundary from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, and from the wilderness to the Euphrates River. For I will hand over the inhabitants of the land to you. This is actually to Abraham. God is saying this is part of his covenant with them. And you will drive them out from you. You shall make no covenant with them or with their gods. You shall not live in your land. Otherwise, they will make you sin against me. And I'm all confused. This is to God's people, but it's off of the land that he promised Abraham. For if you serve their gods, it is certain to be a snare to you. So there it is, right? What are their relationships supposed to be? He says, these are your clear boundaries that I'm giving you land. And it's interesting that these boundaries are well beyond where Israel's current boundaries are. Interesting to note. But, they're not supposed to make any covenant with these other pagan nations. In fact, they're not supposed to live in your land because they're going to be a snare to you. Okay, so this is very clear instructions to his people, Israel. Psalm 2, 1-3 obviously talks about this too, the idea of nations banding together in rebellion against God. We talked about this yesterday a lot. Why are the nations in an uproar and the peoples devising a vain thing? The kings of the earth take their stand, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us tear their fetters apart and cast away their cords from us. This is a caution against alliances that are founded on anti-God, anti-Christ principles, not on unity under Christ. 2 Chronicles 18:3 and 19:2 also talk about warn against supporting those who are of evil in a diplomatic sense, in an alliance sense. It talks about Ahab, king of Israel, who we all know probably here that he was a very, very wicked king, right? Very, very wicked. He said to Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, so this is the period of the divided kingdoms, will you go with me against Ramoth Gilead? Which, by the way, they were godless, wicked people as well. And he said to him, that is Jehoshaphat, said to Ahab, I am as you are, and my people as your people, and we will be with you in the battle. And later on it says, and Jehu the son of Hanani, the seer, that is the prophet, went out to meet him and said to King Jehoshaphat, should you help the wicked and love those who hate the Lord, and by doing so bring wrath on yourself from the Lord? I think this is pretty interesting because if you think about it, it's like, well, Ramoth Gilead, I mean, they're really wicked idol worshippers, and at least Ahab, of Israel is, part of God's chosen people, so, why not support them? It's the lesser of two evils, right? Well, at least in the context of this, God does not want that. He's viewing this still as helping those and tying yourself to those who hate the Lord. And the consequence of that is bringing wrath on yourself from God. I think a pretty clear principle here is that God does not want his people, certainly the nation of Judah, part of his chosen people, but I think we can even extend it at least as a piece of advice to us today if we're in a position of policy making, say as a diplomat or even say a president of the United States or a member of Congress or something. And should we be going to war and supporting a wicked, godless nation, even if they're fighting against an even more wicked and godless nation? I suppose it depends somewhat on the circumstances, but at the very least, this should be a caution to us to be very careful about that. And I mean, you can think of many examples of that today in our modern world. I think one of the most glaring is, for example, our alliance with Saudi Arabia and our support for them and some of their wars they've been fighting against regional adversaries. Saudi Arabia is an extremely godless and wicked nation. It's very hostile to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Just some food for thought. Also, obviously, we should, as Christians, we should seek peace as much as possible and pray for peace as much as possible in the political and diplomatic realms. 1 Timothy 2, 1 and 2 says, first of all, then, I urge that requests, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made in behalf of all people, for kings and all who are in authority. Why? So that we may lead a tranquil and quiet life in all godliness and dignity. So again, we as Christians should pray for, and to the degree that we have influence, should seek policies that lead to peace. Now, obviously, it's not peace at any price, but all things being equal, we should seek for peace in our diplomatic relations with others. Anyone have any comments on that before I move on to the last section? Idea of aligning ourselves with godless nations and also pursuing peace. Okay. Last, we'll talk about Israel. In particular, we'll look at it from the point of we as a Gentile nation in the current age, the church age. How should we have our disposition be? What should our disposition be towards the political entity called Israel today? Well, first of all, obviously we have to keep in mind what God told Abraham. Obviously, he made a covenant with Abraham in general, and there's a lot more to that. But one of the things he said in Genesis 12 was, "And I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." So at a bare minimum from there, I think we can take it as that as Christians, the sons of Abraham, especially in the chosen line of Isaac as opposed to Ishmael, which is today manifested to the greatest extent in the nation of Israel, we should seek to bless them and not curse them, right? At least I don't want God cursing our nation. There's more to that, and we'll talk about it in a minute, though. Here are some examples, though, of, for example, nations that led Israel astray and did not bless them, and God's wrath upon them. Ezekiel 16:27-30 says, "Behold, therefore I stretch out my hand against you," that is Israel, "diminished your allotment and gave you to the will of those who hate you, the daughters of the Philistines, who were ashamed of your lewd behavior. You also played the harlot with the Assyrians because you were insatiable. Indeed, you played the harlot with them and still were not satisfied. Moreover, you multiplied your acts of harlotry as far as the land of the traitor, Chaldea. And even then you were not satisfied. How degenerate is your heart, says the Lord God, seeing you do all these things, the deeds of a brazen harlot." It's very interesting, God likening Israel chasing after other nations and other gods as harlotry, as unfaithfulness to him as their God, their protector, their provider. I think there are some interesting ramifications we can take from that, right? That, first of all, obviously we don't want to be one who conquers Israel and enslaves them. Of course, that's a direct curse. But even leading them astray into depending upon us and playing the harlot with us for protection and provision instead of their Messiah can also be viewed as harlotry. And we should think about that and ramifications in our day. Then here's a case of a country, Egypt, that basically who told Israel, "We will be your help, we will be your support." Illegitimately, obviously, because the Messiah alone is supposed to be their help and the support, but they said they were going to, but they failed to follow through. If you're going to take the place of Messiah, those are big shoes to fill, and you're playing with the apple of God's eye when you do so. And if you come up short, which inevitably you will, it's not going to be good. It says here in Ezekiel 29, "Thus says the Lord God, behold, I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, that has said, my Nile is mine, and I myself have made it, because they have been only a staff made of reed to the house of Israel. When they took hold of you with the hand," that is, when Israel leaned on you for support, "you broke and tore all their hands. And when they leaned on you, you broke and made all their loins quake. Because you said, the Nile is mine, I have made it. Therefore, behold, I am against you and against your rivers, and I will make the land of Egypt an utter waste and desolation." Here's an example of a country that was trying to be a support to Israel, and Israel leaned on them for support, and they fell short. And therefore, God is against them. I think that's a good lesson for us today. And here's the long-term punishment for Egypt. "It will be the lowest of the kingdoms, and it will never again lift itself up above the nations. And I will make them so small that they will not rule over the nations. And it will never again be the confidence of the house of Israel, bringing to mind the iniquity of their having turned to Egypt." So that's saying both it's obviously an iniquity for Egypt, but it's also an iniquity for Israel, having turned to them and leaned on them. "Then they will know that I am the Lord God." So, to this day, Egypt has failed to even reach its former glory, not even close. And we grew up in that culture and can see the firsthand consequences of that curse. So anyone have any comments on that? Because that's some interesting stuff about our relationship with Israel. That we should be blessing them and not cursing them, but that we need to be careful how we define blessing them, right? If we're supporting to the degree that they're becoming dependent on us instead of their Messiah, we're guilty of being partners in harlotry with them. And if in the course of that, we fail to be a trustworthy, reliable staff, which inevitably we will be because we're not Messiah, then we could be subject to God's opposition and curse. I think that's especially important for us to keep in mind today because Israel is not living in the land of belief right now. In fact, they are one of the most secular societies in the world. They support abortion on demand in their country. They are actually hostile to Christian missionaries in their land. in large part. With that said, I'm not saying we should be anti-Semitic by any means. And from a geopolitical standpoint, they are our best ally in the Middle East. And certainly, it's not like their neighbors their enemies are wonderful, God-fearing peoples either. But I think it's important that, especially as Christians, as we advocate for policy from our government and certainly in our own personal disposition toward Israel, we need to be focused on returning them to their Messiah, right? Instead of saying, we are Israel's Messiah, the United States of America, right? To me, that's what I get from these passages. But what are your thoughts on this?
Looking at this, the U.S. could almost take a selfish lean on this and say, so that for a self-protection, we'll be kind and honor you so that God doesn't look up on us.
You're absolutely right. Yeah.
That's a motivation I see that would, if our leaders had enough sense to be able to read, would understand.
Yeah, no, you're right. Yeah, I think most people today in Washington, I mean, the Israeli lobby is very powerful in Washington. It really is. And I think that does play a role. And I think in large part, too, it's just a geopolitical, pragmatic approach that Israel's the only real, so-called true democracy in the Middle East. And they're by far our most reliable and capable ally in the region. And so I think from a pragmatic standpoint, we bless them in that sense, that we want a strong, stable partner in the region, and a very important region, to help us, navigate the complexities there. But I think that we certainly need to be careful about becoming a faulty reed, faulty staff upon which they lean for support, because they certainly are leaning on us for military support heavily. We give them a lot of aid. And again, they're not looking to their Messiah right now. They really need their Messiah.
With regard to the Messiah, doesn't God, has not God shoved him aside until he decides? In other words, is it possible for us today to bring them to their Messiah? Is that within God's plan?
Yeah, well, I think I would say the answer to that is similar to even our aim in terms of advocating for God-honoring laws in our government. Right? We know from prophecy that in the end times, all governments of the world ultimately become corrupted under the reign of Antichrist, and that ultimately Israel will not fully accept their Messiah until after the abomination of desolation is set up, and then ultimately Christ will return and establish his millennial reign, right? So, we can say that, but it's kind of like saying I believe in election, so why should I go out and share the gospel, right? It's like, oh, well, if God's elected people, they'll come to salvation anyway. Why do I go out and share the Christ? Well, yes, God is sovereign, but he still uses us to accomplish his purposes. And just because we know that Israel, in its political sense, will not fully accept the Messiah until after the Antichrist treads upon them, it doesn't mean that in our policy we should be discouraging them from turning to their Messiah, and certainly in our individual ministry, and to the degree that we are involved in supporting missionaries to Israel, etc. We should be seeking to reach them with the gospel, and they, as Israel, they are, even though this is the church age, they're still God's chosen people. That God still, as per his covenant with Abraham, he still has unfinished business with Israel, and so they still are. He still has a program for them. I don't believe, like some, that Israel is no longer special in God's eyes, and that we're in the church age forever, and that's it. No, I believe that God will renew his program with Israel someday, and so his people still have immense value in a unique way. They are a peculiar people, in a sense.
There's no doubt that that's our calling. The church's calling is to go to all people, including Muslims that hate us. I don't have much choice but in the meantime, since you kind of know that God is working Israel according to his own plan,
Yeah.
how do we deal but there may be some reason to
Remember who's in control.
remember.
Howard's in control.
Yeah,
Okay, you know, these things are going to happen. He's told us they're going to happen. And we are going to play a role in some way or another. Maybe not the best role, okay, you know?
Yeah.
But he's going to use his people and the nations to bring about his ultimate plan.
well, I have no doubt about that either, but in terms of our country's, our government's best interest, considering that we're kind of a pagan nation ourselves.
Right.
You know, it's a difficult thing.
It's very difficult.
Whereas you supply the military weaponry to Israel because it maintains
Right.
a balance of power. So,
Right. Right. Like I said, there's. I think our current policyholders are largely, they don't even consider these things. They largely, we talked about just now, I think they're largely just thinking of pragmatically, how can we keep the Middle East somewhat stable and protect our interests, whatever those are, in the region, as opposed to, and keep violent Islamic extremism at bay, keep Russia and China from becoming too powerful in the Middle East and threatening certain oil supplies, et cetera. There are a lot of, Iran is another consideration. So there are a lot of things, and I think even the U.S. uses Israel as a proxy in some ways, and is saying, we want to do a strike on Iran, but if the United States did it, it might not be as accepted and understandable than if Israel's Air Force did it, or something, as an example. And so I think there's a lot of that goes on too. But yeah.
Well, you have to remember 70 years ago when we saw, back in 47, Israel become what we perceived of as a nation again. This nation was a lot more biblically based, as we talked about in other areas.
Right.
And a lot of people knew what the Bible said about blessing and cursing the nation of Israel. And they saw the nation of Israel coming back together as a nation versus a dispersed people.
Right.
And so I think, again, the times, well, they haven't changed, Bondo says they are changing, and I think there was, at least at that point in time, somewhat of a different focus than there may be today.
Right, absolutely. All right, well, we have 5 minutes left until our 11:30 ending of the Q&A period. So if anyone has any questions about anything, this is open Q&A here. I can even stay a few minutes over if you want, but this is open Q&A.